A week that had us dialed in on courtrooms, from the groundbreaking case in Oakland County to the arguments in the highest court in the land. And Lansing searches for a way to help those who can't afford their water bills, which provokes the question again, is clean water a right? Today is Sunday, February 11th, 2024, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. It is Super Sunday. It's going to be impossible for many of us to watch the Chiefs and 49ers tonight without thinking about how close the Lions were to being in the big game for the first time ever. My mere mention of it is obviously evidence that I'm not quite past it, but let's move on nonetheless. This morning, we got a lot of court work to discuss. On Tuesday, an Oakland County jury broke new legal ground in America, laying some of the responsibility for a mass shooting on the parent of the shooter. Jennifer Crumbley is just the first, though. Her husband will go on trial next, though you wonder if he might be moved to reach a plea deal now. But can this approach have any kind of impact on mass violence in America? We're going to talk about the case. We're also going to talk about a couple of legal matters with huge implications for who will occupy the White House at this time next year. Arguments before the Supreme Court on Thursday on whether Colorado can keep Donald Trump off the presidential ballot. And then no charges coming for President Biden on his classified documents case, but stinging comments about his memory from the special counsel. We'll talk about that, too. And a package of bills making the rounds in Lansing that would ask you to kick in more on your water bill to help those who can't pay theirs. Is that fair? It's all today on Flashpoint. All right, we were watching courts this week like we were spectators at Wimbledon. So much to discuss. We're going to go in chronological order. We'll start with the finding of guilt for Jennifer Crumbley, the mother of the Oxford High School shooter. Let's get right to it with the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Nolan Fenley. Mike Bishop, the former congressman for the 8th District and an attorney by trade, we'll point out. Portia Roberson, also an attorney, formerly of the U.S. Justice Department, now the head of Focus Hope. And Nancy Kaffer, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. And Sam, I want to start with you, because as the Crumbley case went to the jury, I honestly felt like I had no idea which way the wind was blowing. You feel like you boiled it down. You wrote that you felt like you could kind of boil it down to a moment.
Well, there's a moment where I thought the tide would turn. I mean, I'm not going to claim that I knew what was going to happen. Yeah. But, you know, on the stand, she talked about how she had seen no signs of her child having these problems. And I will believe that no parent really thinks that what he did is possible. But because of what he did, it's so egregious. It's so hard to believe that there was no sign other than that maybe he was a little anxious and depressed. And I wondered, to me, that felt like, is this the moment where she's lost credibility? Yeah. When people say, she's not being truthful, she must have noticed something, so what else is she not being truthful about?
The jury foreperson, Mike, also mentioned that when she said there wasn't anything she would do differently. I could see why Jennifer Crumbley wanted to say that, but that might not have helped.
No, especially given all the evidence that there was piling up, from the text messages to his behavior to that morning they appeared in school together. All of these things added up to most reasonable people would say, you shouldn't buy that kid a gun, and you should get him some help, and you should be more of a parent and more present. There are a lot of things that that she should have done differently, and the fact that she said that she wouldn't do anything differently, to me, that was my tipping point.
Most parents
can
think of a moment
really
that they wish they'd done something different. Interesting. Portia, does it feel then like a fait accompli for James Crumbley, or do you say different jury, different?
I think,
attorney, everything's different.
Yeah, I thought about that right away, because one of the things the foreperson said was that they sort of looked at her as the last adult who had the gun in her hand.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if the next jury for James Crumbley will feel like he tried to do what he could do to prevent his son being able to have access to that gun. And I guess she left it out, and then he ran home to try and figure out, was it their gun? But I do think, it was interesting, because I don't know what kind of precedence is set. I think there was sort of a sense of relief that somebody else additional than the shooter had been punished. But I don't know if it's going to have the effect that people want it to have, and that it deters people from these kind of mass shootings.
That's really the bigger question here, Nolan. What kind of societal impact? This is groundbreaking, but can it actually be an ingredient in?
Well, I've had some troubles with this case from the beginning. One, they charged Ethan Crumbley as an adult. And so if you're charged as an adult, it suggests you're responsible for your own actions. And so then now his mother's also responsible. I thought he never should have been charged as an adult. And as far as the broader message, who else is going to get caught up with this? Our good parents going to get caught up with this because they don't do everything exactly right. I mean, kids can go bad. And you can't always anticipate it. And most of us don't want to believe our kid can go bad. I think a lot of us would have been same place Jennifer Crumbley was in. Oh, he'd never do that, you know. So was she reckless? Were they bad parents? Yes, but this does have a potential to catch up a lot of other people.
Good parents can buy a biometric gun safe on Amazon for $63. I checked. We hold bartenders responsible for over-serving people. We hold parents criminally responsible for their children's truancy, and this is not unprecedented. People have been charged in shooting deaths with family-owned weapons. It wasn't a mass shooting, but the reality is...
careless with a gun at home, yes.
The reality is that though mass shootings get a ton of attention, our children are much more likely to be killed at our homes or a home of a friend with a family-owned firearm. You know, we incentivized a behavior change with click it or ticket. People didn't used to wear seatbelts. We established a precedent that if you didn't wear a seatbelt, you were going to get a ticket. Yeah. I don't think anybody's goal here is, hey, maybe we can prosecute people after their child kills themselves or someone else. I think it's to incentivize a behavior change. Everyone says they're a responsible gun owner. No one says, oh, me, I'm the problem. Everyone says they're responsible. But by the numbers, some of them are wrong.
That's the law's job, the lawmaker's job, to incentivize behavior change. The court and the justice system, their goal is to deliver justice in that individual case. I think this idea of sending a message, not what the courts are for.
And we'll see what happens here, because we're going to go through a similar situation here now with James Crumbley in March.
He can blame it on her. He won't see her for 15 years. This divide and conquer
of husband and wife is also a really fascinating thing.
Culture puts far more blame on women and mothers for the outcomes of their children and fathers, which is not appropriate or fair. So.
2 days later then, Mike, we were dialed in. I always think it's so fascinating to actually get to listen to Supreme Court arguments.
Yes,
fascinating case here. And it's really interesting. The takeaway, after everybody listened to whether Donald Trump should be on the ballot or not, this debate over what the decision made in Colorado, I don't think anybody will be surprised if it's unanimous that, yes, he should be on the ballot.
I think you're right. I listened to all some hours of the oral argument, and it's pretty clear that the justices are, at the very least, skeptical of the Colorado decision. And I think, especially when you listen to Kagan and Jackson, who are arguably the two most liberal of the judges, their questions were the most fascinating of all of them, I thought, and very thoughtful. And one takeaway I had from this whole process was how fortunate are we as a country to have a system like this where the judiciary takes such a thorough review of things. It just seems so, for the first time in recent history, government looked like it was working. It sounded like it was working. It
a court that's been bashed so thoroughly over the last,
So we'll see.
Interesting, Portia, though, because I think some people would say, look, why are we going to have this amendment if we're not going to enforce it for the highest office in the land? But I guess part of this is still over the debate of whether or not, what was his culpability in the riot/insurrection.
Yeah, and I also think it was in large measure, it's because the Supreme Court has been labeled as being very political right now, right? Their politicism in the Roe versus Wade case and all these other cases that have come before them. And I think they're trying to step that back a bit. And they're saying the people get to decide who's on the ballot. The court does not decide who's on the ballot. And so I think you're going to see more of that. I mean, yes, there is an amendment that should protect us, and we think about that in reference to what's going on. But the reality of it is that I think really what they're saying is we do not want to step in because you're setting a precedent where you're going to be asked to step into a lot of issues where you might not want to as the Supreme Court.
Nancy, what your thought? Does this clear it all up for you, or are you still...
So I'm not a lawyer. I can't really engage with the legal nuances
I got two
like
here
these
that
guys
can help you with it.
But institutionally, we're in an era where people, like Mike said, are doubting our institutions. We have an election system. Kicking Trump off the ballot isn't going to make people more confident in our institutions. There are a lot of people in this country who don't like Donald Trump. There are a lot of people who really do and want him to be president. We tend to cite the social disruption within his person, but it's not. It's in millions of Americans who have these strongly conflicting feelings, and kicking him off the ballot is not going to resolve any of that. It's only going to inflame those tensions. again, I can't engage with the legal nuances, but we have a way to decide if we want a candidate as an election.
So obviously that's going to impact who's going to hold that office a year from now. But Nolan, later that day, this report was issued by the special counsel on classified documents.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever seen a report that exonerates and excoriates in equal measure at the same time. It said that he was not going to be charged for having the documents, but went to great pains to go after the president's recall and memory ability.
Yeah, my column today say, or Friday, they say, we're not going to indict him. We're just going to give him a political death sentence, because that played to the #1 concern voters on both parties. 75% of Republicans, 77% of Democrats say their main concern with Joe Biden is his mental acuity and his age. That report basically just said, hey, you're right. He's forgetful, he's hazy, he's fuzzy, described him as elderly. They presented this picture of an adult old man, and that's precisely the image Joe Biden's facing in this campaign. I think it's over for him.
Was that kosher, Mike, to, at the same time that you're saying in this report, we're not going to charge him, to then include this little drive-by? Not a little one.
This is why I've always had a problem with the special counsel, because they've always had this thing where the report comes back and it throws mud into everything, and yet at the end it doesn't recommend a prosecution. Look what you recall, for example, James Comey, when he got on the TV and he was talking about Hillary Clinton and that report. Everybody thought that she was going down in flames at the end of that as he talked, but then at the end he said, well,
we're not going to
despite all that, yeah.
And the reality of it is, if they had found that there was some criminal wrongdoing, his responsibility was to recommend that the charges were there and that they should indict the president, that they should charge the president. It was not that they should, say all of this about his mental ability and then say, oh, sorry, we don't want to do anything to him because he's elderly. Because
but they didn't do that, Portia. He said willful retention by President Biden of classified documents. And then he said, yeah, but we don't think we can convict him before a jury because they're going to see this feeble old man come before him.
Why would that?
Why would you do that?
But why would that be part of the decision? I mean, I think in some respects we agree. Like, why would you say, if you think you have a valid case there, then charge the man and let him be an elderly man on in court.
Let the jury do what it's going to do.
Exactly. And so
I don't think it's your job to anticipate whether, oh gosh,
the jury would have not.
The jury's going to find him sympathetic.
And this is all part of that institutional erosion, though, right? I mean, because we all, we should note this special counsel was a Republican appointee. This one is a Democrat, this one is whatever, because we have stopped having faith that we're going to get a fair, impartial assessment. This gentleman is a lawyer. If we really need a cognitive assessment of Joe Biden, he's not the one to do it. He's not qualified. Talking about interviews from 2017 where this is not.
And then a few hours after that, Portia, he comes out, for Joe Biden, very unusual to come out with an unannounced sort of news conference, angrily defends himself and his memory, and then makes a blunder over confusing Egypt with Mexico. The same way that Donald Trump just recently,
made
said
Nancy
that Viktor
Pelosi
Orban was
Nancy
the head of
Pelosi
Turkey, which was a surprise to everybody in Hungary.
I mean, listen, if we're going to evaluate any leader, or any person for that matter, over a flub of making a mistake in terms of when they're talking and when they're trying to, lead, then we're going to have a problem finding any leader at all, because mistakes happen. But listen, I know that, one would ask that they could get it right, at least at that press conference.
Which takes us right back to the fact that we're at an election that the American public does not seem to want. So, okay. Friends, thanks so much for the conversation. We come back, we'll talk about a group of bills in Lansing trying to help those who can't afford water by putting the charge on those who can. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Back with more in just a minute. A group of bills in Lansing is aimed at keeping water flowing for lower-income Michiganders. Sounds reasonable to just about anyone, but it would rely on the haves kicking in for the have-nots. Fair? Let's talk about that with Democratic State Senator Stephanie Chang, who is championing these bills, and Macomb County's Public Works Commissioner Candace Miller, who doesn't love it. Let me start with you, Senator. Tell me a little bit about the aims of this. They're fairly obvious, right? But why are we doing it this way? You want about $2. It would cost most residential customers about $2 to help people who can't pay for their bills, right?
Yes, and so, Michigan's the Great Lakes state. We're surrounded by fresh water. The premise of these bills is really simple. We want to make sure that every person in this state has access to water, regardless of how much money they have. And so through these bills, we would ensure that every Michigander who is below 200% of the federal poverty level would get a water bill that is 3% of their household income. And yes, there is a funding mechanism that is modeled after the very successful bipartisan assistance program that we have on the energy space. To really make sure that we create a long-term sustainable funding mechanism so that we can, again, make sure that every single person has access to water. And I would say that actually that funding mechanism is broadly supported by Michiganders. We're continuing to build support every day.
Candace, why is this not a great idea then?
Well, it's $2 a month,
Yeah.
so it's $24 a year, and the legislation allows it to go to $36 a year. And in Macomb County, I can only speak for our county, we are very much into water affordability, which is why we already pay a fee on something called the RAP program that is for every member of the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is most of Macomb County. Mm-hmm. So we already pay into that fee. We generate about $1 million a year, which is left in the county. In our particular case, $1 million a year. And we don't use all the money that we already generate. And we turn the balance really over to the city of Detroit every year. As Oakland County uses about half of theirs, they turn theirs back. But this particular fee would now cost us depending, anywhere from $7 to $10 million a year. So going from $1 million to $7 to $10 million a year, that's money that our county and our municipalities could be using for infrastructure improvements instead of shipping it out of the county.
Senator Chang notes that this is largely supported by Michiganders. What you found in Macomb County, though, was that a lot of people weren't even aware that this was happening, and you've now kind of... Oh, go ahead.
Nobody knew this was happening. Really, when I heard about it, I thought, well, they got to be kidding. They're not really doing this, are they? And then I see that they had been working on it with stakeholder groups. But, you know, part of the stakeholder group that was never polled or talked to were municipal leaders and the people, who are also stakeholders who have to pay for it.
Senator Chang, if Macomb is already doing this on their own, I mean, I guess becomes a matter of local control. I mean, let each county decide how to handle this and start their own.
Yeah, so thank you. So the great thing about this legislation is that we do allow for local providers to continue on with their affordability programs. So Detroit can continue with its Lifeline program, RAP can continue with its program. One of the things that we know is really, really clear is that the RAP program, which has been very successful, does not have enough money. And so Macomb and Oakland and Wayne, everyone is on track to spend all of its allocation, which is really concerning because then we know that there are many folks who would be eligible, who would want to be part of the program that wouldn't be able to when they run out. I'm really concerned about the seniors and people on disability who deserve to have, that assurance that they have a water bill that they can afford. But right now, the Great Lakes Water Authority is very certain that they don't have the money to be able to sustain. And so that's why they are supporting this legislation, as well as lots of regional leaders in this area.
I'm interested to let both of you, weigh in on what I believe we're getting to, which is the crux of the question here. Is water a right, or is it a commodity that I have to pay for?
So, for me, I think what is absolutely true is that everyone should have access to water. You need water to live, right? And so, again, it shouldn't matter how much money you have. I would also point out that water is a public health issue because we know that when someone gets their water shut off, that can lead to really unfortunate circumstances of folks. I've heard of circumstances where folks ended up in the ER because of infection. Their children not being able to go to school because of various health issues. So it's a public health issue.
We don't need much more than Flint to understand the public health side of water, right?
Absolutely. And I think that water is something that a lot of Michiganders really, really care about. And again, this is about making sure that everyone, regardless if you're in Detroit or Warren or the Upper Peninsula or the west side of the state, that everyone has access to water.
So Candace, do I have a right
I'm not
to water?
arguing with some of that. I mean, as I say, we are I think we're a compassionate society. Of course, we need to have water, which is why we are involved in this RAP program. And the senator has said we're about ready to run out. That really has not been the case at all. I don't think you're right on that, not by the numbers, but let's say you are right. The Great Lakes Water Authority can just raise our rate a little tiny bit, and then we'd have plenty of money, and that money would all stay in the county. So I think that's really the way to go. This is really, they're talking about a statewide program. It's really not a statewide program because 30% or 40% of the state is on septics and wells. So they're not included in this. And it's also not based on consumption. So if you're a widow in East Point and you're one person in the household, you are going to pay the same fee as the Walmart store next door. How can that possibly be fair?
So one thing that I would point out is that we've heard a lot of the various concerns from townships and cities and others, and we've been making lots of changes along the way. One, to ensure that there is a cap on how much water you could use if you are in the affordability program. Lifeline program actually already has that, and it has worked out just fine. It's based on the data. And at the same time, we also recognize that we need to move forward with this because we are, again, many of the affordability programs that exist aren't financially sustainable, which is why we need to basically pool the money across the state. We are currently working with a subgroup of a number of experts who know much more than I do about wells to ensure that we
You're not a hydro engineer.
I learn so much every day through this work, and I love it. But we are actively looking at, how can we also help those who are on wells, which may be tied into this or it might be a separate thing, but it is really important because we know that there's a lot of folks who struggle financially there too.
We have about 17 or 18 communities in Macomb County, bipartisanly, Democrats and Republicans on city councils and township boards, et cetera, who have all voted for resolutions to oppose this. So I think we're making our voice very clear about this. And when you keep mentioning the Lifeline program, that started in Detroit about a year and a half, 2 years ago. They were paying for it with ARPA funds, with federal funds. There's already
We all
over
remember the furor over water shutoffs.
There's already over 40,000 people on it. And as soon as they announced it, I said, okay, they've got to find a cash cow for this. And I think this is what has happened here. And we've all had, in the suburbs, we just had this experience with Highland Park, who the suburbs got stuck for $60 million. And then they had to have the state come in with $75 million more to pay for their infrastructure. This is a community of less than 10,000 people. What lesson have they learned? Does anyone believe they're actually going to pay their next water bill?
And you can't really have anybody opt out.
So I want to point out that Detroit will be the biggest contributor to this fund. Also, I'm really proud that the Wayne County Commission just voted for a resolution in support of this legislation. Last week, the Macomb County Board of Commissioners voted to table a resolution in opposition, and the support is growing.
They'll be bringing it back.
So we're going to keep going.
Back, no doubt. Thank you both for giving us a great lay of the land of where these issues are.
Thank you.
You bet. We'll continue with more on Flashpoint in just a minute. Quick update. Since we recorded that conversation on water, a number of leaders from Southeast Michigan have added their support to the water affordability legislation. As Candace Miller predicted, Macomb County leaders so far not among them. That's going to do it for this morning. Thanks so much for being here. Meet the Press is next. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Flashpoint.